with familiar faces now? Did I put it up? Okay, hold on. Okay, yes. I'm so bad with technology. Okay, I think we've got it now. Okay, so welcome. And this week, I'm a little bit more insecure about teaching because the last 2 weeks, I've been teaching people who I read all the time, think about all the time, Plato, Aristotle, and Augustine. I have to work on not mentioning them to my students and my daughters and, not being obsessively just consumed with them. The ones tonight, and it's going to be Aquinas and Calvin and Luther. I am not as well versed in. I would say of the three, even though I'm a Protestant, I would say I know Aquinas much better than Calvin and Luther. And Aquinas has such a gigantic corpus of work that I almost think anyone who says they've read everything he's written is lying, probably. There's a university close by to where I live, University of St. Thomas, where people actually get a PhD in Aquinas, which is sort of unheard. I mean, it's a little bit, to me, it's a little silly, but it also is a little amazing that there is a PhD dedicated to a person's thought, because I don't think that is true of anyone else in the maybe Shakespeare. I don't even think that's true. So he's a big figure to be reckoned with. His thought on beauty is scattered. He doesn't have a specific treatise dedicated to it, which is kind of true of Augustine, definitely, in certain ways Augustine, and somewhat true of Plato. But there's enough there sort of scattered throughout that we'll have a lot to talk about. There's also, one of the other things that we're going to hit on tonight is something that I've realized through reading that I don't know what my opinion is on. I have lots of questions that have arisen as I've been reading and studying, maybe more questions than answers. So I think it'll be fun to hear what you all think, and we can maybe figure out wisdom together as we go. So I'm going to start by giving you 4 of the qualities that Aquinas associates with beauty. And before I do, let me just give you his kind of bare bones definition of beauty, and maybe even ask you what you think of it. So he says, beauty is that which gives pleasure when seen. And I'm going to add on to that and heard, because he says that the 2 senses through which we perceive beauty are sight and hearing. He says that we don't taste something and say that tastes beautiful. And we don't smell something and say that smells beautiful. I don't know to what degree I completely agree with him on that, because I don't know. I tend to think all 5 senses, there's a way in which something can smell beautiful. But part of the reason also, though, is that he connects the encounter with beauty as with an encounter with knowledge. So, and it's actually kind of complicated unless you sort of understand the way he understands the process of knowledge. So one of the things that can strike you about his definition, that which gives pleasure when seen, is that it sounds somewhat subjective. So it sounds like it is all about whether it makes a person emotional or not, or makes them happy or not. And I think that would be the case unless he connected it with what he understands to be knowledge or contemplation. And I'm going to do my best to explain what he means by that. So he thinks that when a person encounters an object, say a tree, since I think trees are awesome, their 5 senses register that tree. They're all of the things that are the tree that the tree is made out of, all those different things. But he says that through the senses alone, you don't grasp what he calls the form of the tree, which is its proportion, its symmetry, its beauty, ultimately. And he says that actually is only known through the mind. So in a very rough sketch, you have a person. He has an idea of there kind of being sort of three parts. This is very rough. I feel like any Aquinas person would just groan when they hear me explain it in simple terms, but that's okay. I'm just going to be okay with that. So you have the bottom part, or the lower part of the soul, which understands things through the five senses. And you have the upper part of the soul, which understands things through the intellect, in a sort of purely invisible sort of sense. And this middle part is where he places the will. He gets this ordering from Aristotle. He also gets it somewhat from Plato. But it's important because he thinks that, in a certain sense, we share this part with animals. So animals can see things with their five senses: see, hear, smell, touch, taste. And they do, to a certain extent, have a will, in that they can decide to pursue something that they want, or to avoid something that they don't want. But what he's going to say they lack is the intellectual component of the self, which then decides what it thinks about the thing it encounters. So it's one thing to encounter a tree, it's another thing to see the tree as beautiful. And so what he thinks is that when a person encounters something that's beautiful, a tree, for instance, that in a certain way, the form of the thing abstracts itself into our mind, and we understand, we can walk away from it, not be sensing it anymore. We're not seeing it anymore, hearing it anymore, but we still have it in our minds, and we can contemplate its beauty and its form. And so that's sort of the way he understands knowledge, and that's the way in which he's going to view beauty as not something that's purely subjective, not something that only happens in our minds when we encounter something, but something that is in the object itself, that we perceive by the form abstracting itself and entering in our minds, and our minds taking delight in it, taking pleasure in it. And in that sense, it's both active and passive. And let me just explain what I mean by that. It's passive in the sense that we're receiving something. We're receiving something from outside of us into our own minds. It's active in the sense that we're doing something different than just what the mere animal can do, which is that we're understanding the form of the thing and that it is beautiful. And so it's this sort of kind of beautiful harmony, and I think a way that God has created us to interact with the world, in which we both receive and we participate and we act. So it's a very abstract to a certain extent, but that's kind of at the basic level what Aquinas is doing with knowledge and appreciation of beauty. Any questions so far? Does that make kind of sense? Okay.
Well, does he address the issue of does beauty exist outside of our ability to sense it?
Yes, he does. He does. So he thinks that the form that is beautiful exists in the object itself. So if the process, so this is why the active and the passive part are important. So if it was just active, if it was just us doing something with our minds, then it wouldn't be in the thing itself. But because the passive is required as like almost a prerequisite, like only once you receive can you act, that makes the object itself contain the form that we then find beautiful. So, and it's interesting because there are, one of the people that I'm going to talk about next week, Kant, is slightly different on this and does end up making it a much more subjective category. Yeah.
Does Aquinas make room for the subjectivity of beauty?
He does in the sense, in this sense.
So if it doesn't give pleasure, then we're not subjectively viewing it as beautiful.
Right. He doesn't talk a lot like Augustine does and Plato do of the way in which our soul needs to be attuned rightly to encounter beauty and to appreciate it the right way. He isn't as much thinking through the questions of what life experiences are going to make it easier or harder for us to encounter it, what things are going to stand in our way or are going to give us sort of a tendency to misuse them or abuse them. He asks that a little bit, but he's more sort of setting up these categories. So, yeah. That's the best I can do with that. So one thing that he does do, and I'll get into this in a second, is in these four things or qualities that he thinks that beauty needs to have. He is going to say not every beautiful thing needs to have all four of these. So you might have one or two and it still be beautiful. It could have some of these things and still not be beautiful. And so he is going to say that even though these things seem to be true in the case of beauty and our apprehension of it, that there's a lot of room for subjectivity and abstract things. So, yeah. Okay. So the four things that he puts into his definition of beauty. And you can already see, those of you that have been here the last 2 weeks, you can already see how different Aquinas is as a thinker from Plato and Augustine. I said before that Aquinas is more taking Aristotle and Christianizing him, thinking about to what extent we can appropriate him, to what extent we have to reject some of the things that Aristotle says. He does. He is also aware of Plato and Augustine and quotes them often, but his thought is very much Aristotelian, and that means scientific and abstract. More so than Augustine and Plato, who tend to be more experiential, more poetic, and more related to the way that we exist and in our personal struggles with beauty and art. So, okay, so here are the four, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on these. They're quite interesting. So, I'm going to write them on the board and then talk about each one. First one, a thing has to have actuality. Second, it has to have proportion. Third, what he calls radiance. And fourth, what he calls wholeness. And one thing that's interesting is he actually takes several of these from what he thinks are the case in Christ. As the sort of the perfect image or representation of God. And he talks about that being the standard for which he's defining beauty. So the first one, actuality. This one's kind of strange because it's sort of just saying the thing has to be. And I think this idea comes largely from Plato and Augustine. It's definitely in Aristotle too, but the idea is that if God has made it, so God, when he created the world and he declared it to be good, and I think he declared it to be at least 7 times, if not more, and also very good, that what we find is that then everything, insofar as it just exists, has to have value and goodness, just at the very basic level, insofar as it is made by God and declared good by him. And so there's something about something being merely an idea versus it having existence, that it having existence, it having actuality, is more beautiful. And one of the ways that I think about this sometimes is my children. So when I was pregnant with my first daughter, I would just imagine, what's she going to be like? Is she going to be like me? Is she going to be like her dad? Is she going to ask a million questions like I did? Is she going to have blonde hair or brown hair? All of these things, and what's it going to be like having, once I found out, even before I found out it was a girl, is it going to be a boy or a girl? What's that going to mean about the dynamics of our family? And then when I found out it was a girl, what is it going to mean to have the oldest child be a girl? Is it going to be a super feminine house? Are we going to have pink things everywhere? What does that mean? And that part was fun and all of that, but and there was beauty in it, but there was something very different that happened when she came into our world. And in all of so it was in a sense that I had like all these unlimited numbers of possibilities for what she could be. And it's true that like I had to take off a lot of those, and it was like, now it's just like in this little, limited realm. So it isn't, I found out she had brown hair. So I'm not going to have a blonde-haired baby, and that was a girl, I'm not going to have a boy. So in one sense, it took off all of these like limitless possibilities. But in another sense, it was like actual. She was real. And even though the possibilities were then limited, they were all existing now, and they were therefore so much more beautiful because of that. Does that make sense? Okay. I should not talk about my daughters too much because I start crying or something, so just avoid it. Okay. Okay, so that's what so I actually think, even though this seems like a redundant or a weird thing to say, oh, if it's beautiful, it has to be actually existing, I actually think it's sort of an amazing quality that maybe we forget. And this is even sort of what we celebrate when we celebrate someone's birthday. We're celebrating the fact that they exist as opposed to them not existing. And it's a miraculous thing. Like, what would our world be like without the existence of this person? And that in some ways changes everything. And so, and it's interesting too, because part of what he includes in his definition of actuality is that it sort of comes to fulfill its full potential. So, and this is actually going to come in a little bit in this later category, but that it isn't just resting as it could be this thing, but it's actually actively being this thing. So sort of like potential and kinetic energy in science, the billiard ball where it's sitting there versus when it starts moving. So that's actuality. Okay, so next one.
Chrissy, is it
Yes.
too early to throw out
No.
commentary?
Yeah, sure. Go for it.
So my limited the detour into philosophy in college that brought me in touch with Descartes
Mm-hmm.
and and Sooner.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the idea of this actuality, sort of the idea of being separate from the thing,
Mm-hmm. The essence.
The essence,
Mm-hmm.
yes. Was the goes along with the medieval sort of concept of things,
Mm-hmm.
because as science comes in and says, well, the brain is just basically an electrical organ.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, everything you perceive is just electrical.
Right. Right.
I see that the falling apart, but
Mm-hmm.
the illustration you bring out with about your daughter is very interesting, because out of all these possibilities, then this sort of rare, unique in the universe thing that becomes.
Mm-hmm.
And so even a tree, yes, there's many trees and no two are alike.
Mm-hmm.
And so while I understand the modernist view of sort of the idea or the thought is really all you have,
Right.
because it's equal with the electrical nerve signals and
Right.
visual signals that your brain is getting to generate this knowledge. The something actually being sort of it locks in all the values.
Yep.
There are no more potentials in that unique combination.
Right.
it's like the actuality almost should really mean to me rarity.
Right.
Unique.
Yes. Yes. So it's strange because you almost want to think that when the possibilities are limitless, it's better. But when it's not actualized, limited possibilities being actualized is infinitely better than infinite possibilities not being actualized at all. And there's even ways in which, when you know this in a person, that even their struggles and their limitations go into being who they are, and that even in itself is more beautiful than the sort of perfect idea of them or something like that. Yeah.
I'm reading a book called The Soul of Beauty.
Mm-hmm.
In there, he talks about how the early Greeks
Mm-hmm.
really equated beauty with being.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And that's what beauty meant.
Mm-hmm.
Just the fact that we existed.
Yes. Yes. That's definitely true for them, and in a certain sense, and it's a little bit different in Plato and Aristotle. With Plato, there's this way in which things are more and more and more real, or have more and more being, the more eternal they are. So the things that moth and rust can destroy, in a certain sense, for him, have less being, than less actuality, and therefore less beauty than the things that moth and rust cannot destroy. And the soul being one of those things, and God being the ultimate of that thing. Yes.
So today I saw something that relates to this, and there were two doors that people were walking through, and one had beauty over it and one had average over it. Have you seen that yet?
No.
It's one of the Dove things that I think it's pretty new.
Mm-hmm.
And so they showed women getting ready to go through these doors, and there were mothers dragging their daughters through the beautiful one. And many people chose average, and they did it all over the world. It's really amazing.
Interesting.
Yeah, so so the ancients would have automatically gone.
Right. They would have. They would have.
I mean, but we don't think of ourselves that way.
Right. No, we don't. We don't.
But we don't want anybody to think we did.
Yeah.
What if you just wanted to get to the other side and didn't know which door you went through?
What they would go to.
Well, here's what the ancients would have done, though, too. The ancients would have said, there's physical beauty and there's beauty of soul. Physical beauty, it passes away, and so it has less being. Whereas beauty of soul, which connects with goodness and love and virtue and closeness to God, has far more being, and is therefore far more beautiful. And so maybe,
I wonder if we still believe that,
yeah.
or if it's reversed.
I mean, I think that we're taught to, by good parents, teach us to believe that our insides matter more than our outsides. But
Society doesn't say that
no,
anymore.
no. I mean, you have to fight a mental battle, I think, every day to keep believing that. Maybe for women more than for men, possibly. I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe not. Was there a comment?
I changed my mind because one of the caveats at the beginning was you said that not everything that's beautiful will have all.
Yes.
So-
Right.
So I
Okay.
let it go.
Okay. Well, if you want to bring it back later on,
Okay,
feel free.
We'll see where we keep going.
Okay.
Fine.
Okay. So, proportion. This has to do with either symmetry or something being well balanced. Anyone have thoughts as to why these are sort of two slightly different things?
Can you describe what you mean by well balanced?
Well, that'll give my answer away, but I can unless someone has a guess. Yes.
Well, symmetrical is it's exactly the same left right. We know
Right.
that well balanced can be, you can have some visual balance where they're equally weighted,
Mhm.
but maybe it's not exactly the same.
Right.
I mean, you can have three, this is the simple example of my kids I use. You know, you have a teeter-totter and you've got the great big football player on one end and
Mhm.
three kids that add up to him on the other
Yep.
end, you know, and so, I mean, it's,
Yeah, or things where they are
Mhm.
is a big, you got something really big in close and something really little out far.
Mhm.
So there's a lot that
That's-
goes into well balanced that
That
doesn't go into.
that if you only have this, you're actually missing a ton of proportion. So yeah, symmetry it isn't to be discounted. I mean, I think that it's even, and just in terms of physical beauty, when they do these tests on people looking at people's faces, people are automatically attracted to the ones that have more symmetry than others, and so there's something ingrained in us that is drawn to symmetry, and to order in that sense. Well balanced, though, I think, Aquinas actually points to a couple of examples. One is he thinks there's a beautiful balance between the relationship of the creator to the creature. He says it's like the effect to the cause, although I still think that's a little bit too cold and sterile of a description. Not to denigrate the fact that God is our cause and we're his effect, but if you're looking for symmetry, there's no symmetry there. I mean, we don't have, however many creatures, and our perfections don't add up to what is on the side of the Creator God, but there's some sort of beautiful proportion or well-balancedness in our relationship to Him. That when it's off balance, there's not proportion. So when we try to be bigger than He is, for instance, we're wildly out of proportion. Or when we try to assert ourselves independently of Him. So it's a little bit tricky to say this because you don't want to necessarily say that God needs us to have balance or proportion. So in certain ways, the metaphor can break down, but in terms of at least being a creature, it's really beautiful because it's the idea that we can't even think of ourselves as beautiful unless we think of ourselves as being created by a beautiful God. And I think this also makes sense of music, the way especially classical music works. If you listen to Mozart or Beethoven, you listen to the music kind of work itself up into this sort of fevered pitch, and it gets, but it sort of slowly gets you there. It'll start sort of, barely audible, and then, and I remember when I used to try to listen to it as background music while I was studying, I was like, this doesn't work at all, because it would sort of be really quiet, and then boom, 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 all of a sudden, and scare me to death. So, but there's something that happens where it's quiet and it works itself up, but then it resolves again. It resolves itself, and it is working. I can't even describe it in words, but it's working somehow with your mind's desire for proportion, not for symmetry, because you don't look at the song, a classical piece, and see the exact same thing for the first half as you have for the second half. But you do see this proportion and balance of what it takes you through emotionally, and then as it resolves at the end, the good music does that. And even when you're teaching art students how to notice balance in a picture, you're not necessarily teaching them to look just for symmetry, right? And it's kind of hard. I mean, it takes a while for them to even know what balance means, because they understand symmetry, but this is a little bit more abstract. But yeah, you get to this point where they can see, the empty space, the positive space, and all the different things in the way that goes together. So he thinks that this really goes into the definition of what we need for beauty. Okay. Any questions on that before I go to the next one? Okay. Radiance. So this is a quote from a author by the name of Gilson, who, if you want to read people on Aquinas, I would say there's 3 people you should read on Aquinas if you're going to read on Aquinas. Gilson, Maritain, and Pieper, not Piper, but Pieper. I actually brought a book that I highly recommend, Guide to Thomas Aquinas by Joseph Pieper. I think you should read anything written by this author, but this one is really good. But so, quote by Gilson: "Radiance belongs to being considered precisely as beautiful. It is in being that which catches the eye or the ear or the mind and makes us want to perceive it again." So it's very much connected to the medievals' idea of light. So light catching the eye, catching the mind, wanting to see it again. It's something that sort of, I guess, awakens us all of a sudden and shines a light into our soul in a way that we are awake to something that we were not awake to before, or something becomes clearer in a sort of beautiful light than it was before. And he thinks that this is sort of mirroring what divine light is. And this happens for me actually when someone, this happens for me in really good preaching. When a preacher, so Augustine talks about how in good preaching your goal can be to just inform your congregation of things they didn't know before. But he also says that sometimes your congregation knows it, but they aren't delighting in it. So they know what's true, but their emotions aren't aroused to delight in it. And so he says that one of the ways that you can do this is by describing something in a way that shows its beauty. Not just something that you put into your pocket of knowledge, but something that catches you, that makes you want to see it again. And I think really good preachers take Bible stories, especially if you've grown up Christian, or you've just heard it so many times that you've lost a sense of wonder to the story. The Good Samaritan or any of the parables or whatever, and somehow through poetic storytelling or whatever way, a radiance is cast upon the story, and it makes you all of a sudden see it with so much more clarity, and it makes you want to go home and read it more. And be almost sure that you will find more things when you read it, even though you've heard it, your whole growing up life experience. And so that is kind of, it's a little bit of a quality that's hard to describe, but it arouses the emotions. It makes you want to see it again. It's sort of like what happens when Christ is transfigured in front of the disciples, where he's the same Christ. He's been the whole time, but his glory shines all of a sudden in front of them, and God allows that to happen. And so the beautiful allows something that's already true to seem more true or be seen by us as true in a way that we weren't seeing it before. And I think I do think really good artists do this. So just one really, maybe, I don't know how much you'll agree with me, but I think Georgia O'Keeffe does this with flowers. The more that I see her work, the more I slow down and look at the beauty and the form and the symmetry and the proportion and all the things that are going on in a simple flower that I would not have noticed before. And I think a lot of artists are in some ways training you on how to see reality. They're noticing things all the time that we're passing by. And so once they sort of shine a light on it, you then encounter your world differently, because those things start to light up around you everywhere you go. So does that make some sense? Okay. So the last quality, wholeness. So this one I think is somewhat connected with actuality, but it's fuller in the sense that it is, in certain ways, the perfect blending of what I would say being and action. So the best way to describe this is, whereas with actuality, it's just the fact that the thing exists that makes it beautiful, that it isn't simply an idea in the mind, but it's been brought into actuality. Wholeness is when all of the potentials of the thing, all the things that it was made to be, are finally being actualized. So when my daughter was born, I'll go back to my daughter at the risk of crying, so I probably won't, we'll see. When my daughter was born, you know, it was this amazing thing. I remember I would sit and just like watch her and memorize like every line on her face, every single twitch of her eyes. I would think, oh, what's she dreaming about? You know, oh, she's going to be this or that or whatever, you know. And it was so fun. But then like, and I always thought like, oh, this is my favorite stage, you know, like, I mean, I just loved every time, but like, so the first few months I was like, she's so easy. She just wants to be with me. I just love to like try to make her smile. I can like work on that for 2 hours and I get one smile and I'm like walking in the clouds, you know, all day, seriously. You know, but then like she says her first word, which was mama. I was like, I had read that it was supposed to be, that it's usually daddy, and I was like, no, it's going to be mama with this one. And I was like, I won. Anyway, it was ridiculous. But, so, you know, she said her first word. She started to crawl, and then to cruise, and then to walk around. Now she's doing ridiculous things like listening to Shakespeare and talking to me about her preferred translation of the Bible, and she's only 8, and you know, and it's crazy. And it isn't that she's any more beautiful now than she was when I first saw her on the first day of her life. But there is something amazingly beautiful about watching her potentials come into actuality, like more and more and more and more. Yeah.
It's more like fulfilling your purpose.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. It's like being who God made her to be. And she was who God made her to be on her first day of her life. But each day I get to see a little bit more of that come into fruition. And so what Aquinas is saying about beauty is that we delight and we are pleased the more we see the actualization of a thing's potential come into existence. And so there's something added to it when there's a wholeness to it. And that's why God is the most beautiful, because there isn't anything left that he hasn't actualized. It's all there. It's sort of all there waiting for us to discover in a certain way. So does that make sense? Okay. Any comments or questions? So you were saying before, you weren't sure about it because he said, you know, you could have it or lack it. So
I'll just tell you what my
Sure.
the simple thought. When
Okay.
I did the actuality of talking about beauty and it had to actually exist, the first thing that popped in my head was, and it kind of goes with the Dove beauty, like the beauty and the average, and it's our perception of what beauty is. And,
Yeah.
and we get put in our face these Photoshop images every
Right.
day. And so I kind of chuckled to myself and I thought, it doesn't exist, it's not beautiful.
Yeah.
It can't exist.
Huh.
I mean, as some women and men too get
Mhm.
portrayed, there's no way they can
Yeah.
exist as they're presented.
So in certain ways, I think Aquinas would argue that the photoshopped image is less beautiful because there's less actuality going on. That the more actuality, the more, and we naturally we get sad when we know it's photoshopped because we're like, oh well, you know, whatever, anyone can do that, but we want to see the actual person. I hope we do. So.
Anyhow, that was, and so, but then I went back and looked at my notes and I said, but that doesn't, that you don't have to have all of them.
Right.
You know, and so that's why I held back. But
Right.
But
Right.
since I've created curiosity, I'll go ahead and answer.
Sure.
That goes back to what you were saying
yeah.
about the possibilities versus the reality.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. You have in the Photoshop, you have possibilities, but it isn't actualized in an actual human being.
And it's not reality.
And it's not reality. I mean, I think I heard that Barbie, proportionally, if she really existed, she would not be able to walk like on. She'd fall over and have to, be on all fours, so which is disturbing. So, yeah.
Not as disturbing as the women trying to look like Barbie.
Right. Oh, absolutely. Okay.
Bible study that I just kicked back from. I know it's very, very popular.
Mm-hmm.
I think you use 4 or 5 colors as you go through the study.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't want that because it predetermined when I went back to read that again that this is.
So how did it use colors?
Well, you color like a main thought or the
Okay.
semantic intent or whatever, so that each It's very popular.
Okay.
But I didn't want to go back,
Mhm.
because I see like this Radiance thing.
Mhm.
Every time I read something, it depends on where I am in life.
Yep.
Who's on my stage, who are the characters
Mhm.
at that time,
Mhm.
what are my feelings, what are my emotions?
Yeah.
And so I didn't want something to predetermine, so I go
Pins
back.
it down.
It does.
Mhm.
You wouldn't go back and see it in a new way.
Exactly.
Well, there's so many facets, you know, you can
Mhm.
look at a diamond
And
in so
as you
many
grow
different
older,
ways.
I mean, you see everything so differently.
Oh, gosh,
Mhm.
that's the truth.
Yeah, yeah, and maybe what's happening as you get older is this wholeness thing is happening. You know, that you were able to see certain things actualized when you were younger, but that as you get older, you just start. I mean, I'm like young, but well, I don't know. It's young, who knows? But I'm already seeing certain passages. I remember, well, my daughters and I memorized Isaiah 53 this early spring together. And I remember Isaiah 53 really hitting me hard, and when I read it for the first time, I think in high school, and I just thought, like, I was amazed at this picture of Christ. But reading it just a few months ago and then committing it to memory, which just makes every word start to sort of stick to your soul in a way, I just started to see all these ways that it had been, this picture of what Christ is and what is good had been the kind of the Christ that I've encountered over the last several years in ways that I would have never been able to understand as a high schooler. I mean, it would have sounded like an abstract description. And so, yeah, I think that beauty in certain ways over the years becomes, you know, more important and more apparent as you get older. It seems like it would. Okay. Any other thoughts? Okay, so we're going to move to the more controversial part of the talk tonight, and I'm actually really excited because I feel like I need help on it. I don't know what I think completely. So it has to do with what is sometimes called iconography. And the versus who are called iconoclasts. Icon just comes from a word that means picture or image. And so what's happening in the history of philosophy, history of theology, in this time period that we're looking at, is you have Aquinas, and Aquinas is, this is when the Catholic Church is much more fully, I would say, developed in terms of a lot of the doctrines that they hold today. They recognize Aquinas as the sort of prime philosopher that represents their thought. And you have a very, very strong tradition of using images in worship. So the beauty of the church building, the pictures that are depicted on the walls, part of this had to do with the fact that during the medieval times, so few people could read. I mean, almost no one. There were a lot of kings that could not read. I remember I was teaching my students about King Alfred, and the other kings, or the other people at the time just thought it was so strange that he wanted to read. I mean, why would you learn to do that? And it's like he was a king. I mean, we expect our presidents to know how to read for sure, hopefully more. But so the pictures in the church actually taught people who couldn't read the Bible a lot of the stories from the Bible. So they would come to church, and just by looking at the pictures on the church walls, they were able to learn a lot that they wouldn't have been able to learn otherwise. But there also was a lot of veneration of saints. So pictures that were painted of great Christians, of Mary, definitely of Jesus. And at this point, there was praying to them, sort of, depending on exactly, how you think about it. And so then what happens is the Reformation. So 1517, you have Martin Luther, who nails his 95 Theses on the Wittenberg door. And those theses were not about everything that he thought was wrong with Catholicism. They were really primarily about what he thought was wrong with indulgences. But what then came under discussion, though, among other things, was the use of images in the church. And what really sort of occurred with the Reformation thinkers was, in a lot of ways, a group of what are called iconoclasts, which are theologians that speak against the use of images in worship. Now, what I've found, just by reading I've done over the last week, and it's a little bit tricky because I've realized the editor of this book, I looked up who she is, and I found out she's Lutheran, and she did pick much more pleasing excerpts about Luther than she did about Calvin, and I can tell she doesn't like Calvin. But I actually was sort of appalled at some of the things that I read that Calvin wrote. So Luther actually seems to be, in my mind, much more balanced on this question of the use of images and art in worship. Calvin actually speaks against any use of images at all in the church, and even was in favor of destroying a great art that had been done. So there were several reformers at the time that would go and whitewash the walls of these churches that had incredible Renaissance art paintings of Jesus and his disciples and Stations of the Cross, all of those things, and basically would destroy anything that was an image or a carving that was in the church, and expressly teach against ever depicting Jesus in any sort of artistic form whatsoever. So,
When you speak of image, are you speaking of images of people or any image?
let me. I'm not sure. What Calvin spoke against was any image at all in the church. So, if it was not in the church, he was in favor. He was okay with painting images, but not ones of Jesus, and it would be things in the sort of beauty of creation. So,
An image of a
landscapes.
pomegranate,
Yes,
yes.
yeah.
An image of a person, no.
Well, a person, but not Jesus.
In person, but
Yeah, not or saints.
God.
Yeah.
Oh, no saints either.
Yeah, no saints either.
Even outside the church.
Right.
Oh.
Right. So let me read this first, just to sort of set a stage or a setting for what I think that was concerning them, and then read a little bit of what Luther said and what Calvin said, and then just see what you guys think. So one thing that I noticed somewhat recently as I was reading through Exodus is that when Moses describes the Ten Commandments, it's interesting. Some of them he just lists, so, you should not murder, you should not commit adultery, and that's it. There's a couple that he kind of goes into detail about what he exactly means by them. And the two that he goes into a lot more detail on are the one about the carved image and the one about the Sabbath. And when I read the one about the carved image, I was actually sort of taken aback at how strong it is, and how whenever I hear thou shalt not create a carved image, you never hear the part that comes right after it, which is extremely explicit about prohibiting their creation and their use. So this is Exodus 20, and I'm reading from verses 4 through 6. So he says, "You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers and the children to the third and the fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments." So there's sort of three things that I notice here. One is that it says, and this is the second thing it mentions, that you shouldn't bow down to or serve images. I think that's what we tend to think of when we think of this commandment, not to bow down to them, not to worship them as an idol. But what is striking to me is that what it says before that is not just not to bow down to them or worship them, but to not even create them. So to not create anything that has any likeness to anything in heaven, anything on the earth, anything under the earth. I don't know if that means fishes or what. And then what it ends with is the jealousy of God. So then the question is, like, what do you do with that? Like, what does that commandment mean for us today? And it's tricky. I mean, a lot of the law of the Old Testament, the Levitical codes and things like that, we don't have to offer sacrifices on an altar, anymore. But I always thought of the Ten Commandments as being things that we still obey. Not murdering, not committing adultery, all those things. So if that's true, then what do we do with this one?
Well, if you take it with the don't bow down to it, and look later at when he's telling Bezalel to create all of these pomegranate things and all of them, which is why I mentioned pomegranate. He has him create images of things that are on the earth. So I think it has to be linked with the don't create this to bow down to. Don't create this in order to be a worship item.
Right.
That you're worshiping the item.
Right.
That you've made.
Right.
Or he wouldn't have said.
Or he wouldn't say later.
If you say don't do that and then say Bezalel, you do that.
Right. Right. I know that.
Consistent.
Yeah, I know that the Jews did tend to be iconoclasts. Did tend to resist creating any kind of image, especially something that was meant to depict God. So in terms of the way that the Jewish tradition interpreted this, there did seem to be somewhat of a strictness about it, although you're right. Luther actually mentions a couple of exceptions as well. The cherubim on the altar. Right.
That's in the heaven above.
Right. So there's a couple of things you can ask. One is were these exceptions? So like Jesus healed people on the Sabbath, right? And there's other things he did on the Sabbath that he strikes people dead for doing in the Old Testament. So is it that this is a general rule except for when God says it's okay? Or does it mean that we just ignore the first part where it says not to create it and we just pay attention to the second part which says to not bow down to it? I don't know.
Ignoring it if you're linking them, you're saying you don't do it for that purpose.
Right.
It's not ignoring it.
Right. I mean, it does seem to make two separate points, at least the way the passage reads. Yeah.
As an artist and a Christian, when I read the commandment, if you do take it in isolation, you're pretty much saying, God wants me to only be an abstract artist depicting images of nothing.
Which is the way Islamic, they'll only do patterns, right? They won't do any images.
What Nancy brought up, I think, it's the way I interpret the passage, is that in this, not even in another book or another part of the Bible, but on Mount Sinai, God gave Moses the Ten Commandments, and also the names of the artists and the helper, Bezalel and Oholiab, that were called to create the tabernacle.
Right.
And the design for the tabernacle included
the cherubim.
things that, if you just take the commandment in isolation, were expressly forbidden.
Right.
The cherubim, heavenly spiritual beings are imaged. Fruit is imaged.
There's also the snake that's up on the pole that the Israelites look up to.
Absolutely.
And that's carved.
Absolutely. And the probably the best example of what's an idol and what isn't is exactly the brazen serpent, the snake that Moses lifted up, because it goes from being a sort of a sculpture of faith, if you will, that people look to as commanded by God and are healed. Then it becomes an idol in which people are bowing down to it in and of itself and worshiping, and God has it destroyed.
Right.
Then in the New Testament, Christ himself says, the Son of Man must be raised up like a serpent.
Right.
And so you have this thing that was good at one time, And while it was good, it even prefigured Christ.
Right.
But then it became bad.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
Yeah.
to me, the way to interpret that is to look at the whole context of all of those
Right.
occurrences. And you're left with use.
Yeah.
It's use
Yeah.
that makes something damnable or not.
Right.
In my, that's
Right.
how I interpret it.
Right. Yeah. So this is what Luther ends up saying, that it's use and not the image itself. He says that the image, it isn't on its own good or bad. That it's the use that's made of it. One of the things that becomes tricky in Protestant Catholic conversations is, what does it mean to? Where's the line between venerate and worship? And so Catholics, in the Council of Trent, are commanded to venerate pictures of saints, and actually are commanded to see a picture of God, of Jesus, as having equal weight to reading about Jesus in the Bible. Whereas Luther is going to say there isn't anything wrong with depicting Jesus, because when I read about him in the Bible, I think about him in my mind, and if I'm allowed to see him with my mind's eye, I should be able to see him with my actual eyes, depicted by an artist. And I have the quote here. There are a lot of thinkers, and not just Protestants. So there's a few early on in the early church. Justin Martyr, Lactantius. This is in the second and third centuries, who were against the creation of any images for in a worship space. So there are quite a few thinkers that are going to say that there's something off about, especially depicting Jesus in art, but then also using images in a worship space. So I was honestly surprised how extreme Calvin is on this. And I talked to a few people today. I was like, "Oh, did you know that Calvin says this?" And a couple of them actually were like, "Yeah, I've always felt weird about artists trying to depict Jesus in art." And I guess I would even confess myself that the thought of doing that, I don't want to. As myself as an artist, I wouldn't even know where to begin, and I would almost feel like I was doing something, I don't know, like Fear and Trembling or something, like Jesus's face. What does Jesus' face look like? I have no idea. Probably not white with blue eyes. Like the children's Bibles, make him out to be or whatever. But at the same time, that would mean no Passion of the Christ movie, right? And that would mean all of these Renaissance paintings of him with his disciples that taught people stories about him. That would be done away with too, and I don't want to go there either.
Does that mean
So-
that cameras existed in the first century that we couldn't take a picture?
Yeah, it's interesting because so Kierkegaard says a little bit about this. He thinks that if a person were desperate to try to follow Jesus and watch his every move externally and sort of memorize exactly what he looked like, that he would actually be more in danger of not getting Jesus than someone who is in our place, can't access what he looks like, but knows he was a real person, but isn't obsessed with what are his exact facial features. It's interesting. The Bible doesn't describe him. It says that there is nothing of beauty in him that men would look on him. So, I don't know. Maybe it was on purpose that cameras weren't invented yet when Jesus came. Oh, I know. The what do you call it? Felt board Jesus. Yeah,
But is that actuality?
Right. Yeah. So what do you? I kind of wanted to open this up a little bit for discussion. So there's a few questions on the table. One is the use of images in public worship. It's interesting. So my daughter, Claire, my 8-year-old, she went to the Wednesday night kids thing last week. And so did my other daughter, Annalise, who's 5. And I picked them up afterwards. I was like, oh, did you have a great time? Annalise had a great time. She like learned some words in Spanish, and you know, she had a little craft of a flower and things like that. And I picked up Claire, and Claire was sort of disturbed. She was like, Mom, I'm not sure if I want to come back here again. And I was like, why? And she's like, this place does not appreciate the arts. And I was like, what? And she was like, they showed us pictures of superheroes, and they said that was like Jesus. And she was like, I feel like I've just seen God mocked.
Wow.
And
5-year-old?
it was my 8-year-old. My 8-year-old. She said she said that, and she said it made it feel like Christianity was easy.
Was what?
Was easy.
Wow.
Like a superhero.
Yeah. And so, who knows? You know, I kind of worked on her because I don't want her. I just don't want her to be prideful, and I don't want her to think she's better than people. But I also wanted, you know, I understood the idea of like she had this very like strong view of Christ being what he is, and so seeing him compared to a superhero just like offended her or something.
Probably just more mature than your average 8-year-old.
She might be.
A 12-year-old would probably look at that lesson and say, oh, come on.
Yeah, maybe so. Yeah, she said she found a disabled boy who she said hasn't been ruined by the stuff yet, and so she's like, I can connect with him, which. Whatever, you know, there's just drama of being a parent. But anyway, so it's interesting because like a lot of Protestant churches don't have a lot of art in the sanctuary, right? We have like giant speakers and barely neat, you know, often not stained glass windows sometimes. So sometimes there is something that these churches are saying about aesthetics, possibly. Sometimes maybe the efficiency matters more than aesthetics, I don't know. But on the charitable side, is it possibly also saying that these things can distract and the message is the thing that we want people to get when they come in, which is kind of what Calvin was saying. He was worried that there was a distraction going on, possibly. So just if you look at the state of Protestant churches, you sort of see things across the board. Generally, Catholic churches have you can walk in, you can tell they think images in worship are a really important part of it. There's almost like no question. So what do you all think of that question?
What about someone with a disability? That just kept coming up because those are part of my profession.
Mhm.
What about someone who's visually impaired and they want to feel? How do they feel? You know, you have to be a really good wordsmith.
Right.
In the Bible, touching their heart is what usually happens.
Right.
And reading to them if they can't Braille.
Right.
To understand.
Okay.
You know, the radiance.
So someone who's blind, something that's visual on the walls won't do as much. Okay.
And churches themselves are built to, like the churches in the round so the devil can't hide.
Mm-hmm.
And all of our churches have a central aisle
Mhm.
because it draws your focus. And
Mhm.
it's built that way specifically.
Right.
So could that be considered one?
Sure. I mean, I think there's always an intentional aesthetic going on. So I don't think it's a difference between aesthetics and no aesthetics. I think there's always thought about why we're having very few images or why we're having lots of them, where the eye is drawn when you go in. So yeah, the question is are the reformers' concerns warranted, or are we kind of behind on not making those more of a part of our sanctuary and our worship environment? Yeah.
It seems like people trying to look at other people and trying to control what they, you know.
Okay.
And their fear that, you know, they won't act a certain way.
Mhm.
That trusting in the spirit of each one of us to.
Okay. So do you think there's fear inspiring not putting images in, or fear inspiring putting images into?
Trying to predict how people react to them.
Okay.
And fear that they will act a different way.
in an idolatrous way or something if they're there. I mean, it's interesting is we have the Imago show downstairs. But that's not in the. It's not that we have things up in the sanctuary, right? I mean, it's up as a show outside of our worship space. So again, the question has to do with what do those images do in a worship space? Yeah.
Well, when I took architecture in
Mhm.
college, what our teacher taught us was that the images and the sculpture that were used after the Renaissance,
Mhm.
and it was used by the Catholic Church to draw people back to the church.
Mhm.
Okay, as a fear, as a propaganda. So it's an architectural, and you can see it all over the churches after the Renaissance, because people started to think that there were, after the Black Death, is it really a God? Is it only us? So they use it. They use images and very dramatic images,
Right.
to draw people back to the church.
Okay. Do you think to scare them back to the
Scare
church?
them back to the church to
Okay.
control them.
Okay.
So it's and they intentionally they use the scale of it.
Mhm.
They use the there's drama on those.
Right. Right. So
That was meant
yeah.
to be worshipful too. I think a lot of the original intents of both
Yeah.
fields
Yeah.
were to try to attract people, and help people to worship.
Right.
And to make use of, sometimes it's a reaction to the abuse. Like
Right.
these beautiful cathedrals and stuff were meant to be worshipful places, and
Right.
whether you have sight or not, there's a sound and a feel
Yep.
in a cathedral that is very, very worshipful.
Right.
Right. But then you think of all the cash that went to this building
Right.
instead of helping the people.
Right.
And you have the reactionary people who have simplified the churches.
Right. Whitewash
to make
the
sure
walls.
that they're spending their money,
In other ways.
in ways on people. So yeah, I think at least originally, probably most of the decisions
We're honorable or
Right,
yeah.
and we corrupt everything.
Right.
Yeah.
We do. I mean, we do. It's sad. Yes.
Well, and I feel like part of it is that how our current Protestant worship services are structured isn't necessarily because of we can't have images because of this, where originally it came through the reaction against the excesses and
Right.
the veneration
Yeah.
and worship of these images that happened after the images started to become more and more important and
Right.
central.
Right.
But now, because of how we conduct worship, there is more of a focus of how we use our artistic things. So when you go into a cathedral, if you're going in for a service, how much of your time are you spending looking at everything and not listening
Right.
to what's going on, as opposed to
Right.
when you go into a kind of blank wall worship center,
Right.
where they can give you video art, they can give you like dance or movement, whatever you want to call it.
Right.
They can give you
Music.
and use art and artistic expression, but in a very focused way, where
Right.
you keep your attention on what you're supposed to be worshiping, when you're supposed to be worshiping
Right.
it, as opposed to, here, let me tune out anything
Right.
talking about God, and I'll look at the sparkles.
Right, true. So there's one thing that's interesting that I went to an Episcopal service recently. I go to an Acts 29 church, so it's a little bit less strong on the images. And it's called Acts 29. It's connected with Matt Chandler, but Sojourn in Montrose. But I went to an Episcopal service, and the sanctuary actually is quite simple in a lot of ways. But one thing I did notice is there were a lot more times of silence for us to slow down and pray. And so there wasn't a program telling us this is where your attention's supposed to be focused constantly the whole time. There were a lot of times for us to sort of have time with God. And I noticed that my surroundings, every time my eyes would lift and sort of look around, all the things around were so sacred that I wanted to go back into myself and speak to God. And it wasn't because a video was playing, and it wasn't because like, oh, what song are we on or whatever, but there was something about the reverential space that took me to that place.
Well,
And
that's just part of how different services are structured
Right.
in the different.
Right.
Because it's true, like when I walk into a Catholic church, even when I wasn't Christian, I walk into the first Catholic church in Europe, and it felt
you feel,
holy.
Yeah.
In a
Yeah.
way, which is lovely.
right,
But then there's also how do you pace that? How
Right.
do you keep people's focus on God?
yeah. Yeah, oh, and even it can be, because it can even be that you focus on the church as opposed to God, which, yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
But I think just to keep it in a macro perspective, is there's all these different flavors. There's different crayons in the coloring box. Let's not be so hard on ourselves.
Right.
In that, at least we're making an effort. Whatever
Yeah.
color you choose out of the box. I think beware
Right.
for ourselves to, point the finger. Well, this is the right or not the right way, or right way to think about doing it, or
Yeah.
right way to worship. At least we're trying to make an effort in
Right.
worshiping whoever those
Absolutely.
individuals may be.
Absolutely,
So
yeah.
let's celebrate, let's celebrate that. It may not be our style or
Right. Well, and I don't,
exclusive for ourselves, but
yeah. Well, and I don't see us doing what Calvin, what Calvin describes, which is like we should go destroy anything that has to do with art in any church. I don't see us doing that. But yeah, I think there is a lot of space for thinking about different. I mean, and if you just think about the early church, they met in houses. They sat around in people's houses and they worshiped together, and sermons would go on for hours. Someone even fell out of a third-story window and died. I don't know if it's third or what story it was. Yeah, so I mean, they didn't have videos, but they also didn't have a giant altar at the front or anything. They just had home churches. So, and Jesus was okay with that.
There were
Two hands.
Your hands
Okay,
right in
yes.
front of me that I want to
Yes.
make sure we hear from.
Definitely.
Keith, I'm looking at the back of your head.
What?
You had your hand up?
Oh, that was a long time ago, I forgot.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I go to a large Episcopal church.
Okay.
It's modeled after a cathedral in Marlborough, Germany, although it's about 20% of the size. Stained glass, 170,000 panes, big pipe organ, big choir. You walk in there, you don't talk. Reverence is the key.
Yeah.
And when I first came from First, it's not saying that First type of worship was wrong. It was different. But one thing I noticed, it made so much sense based on my own training, was that when you pray, you kneel. When you sing, you stand. And when you're taught, you sit. And they also read the New Testament. And there's an Old Testament reading,
Right.
but it's not always read.
Right.
So you cover the whole Bible through the 12 months. When I took preaching,
Right.
they had us buy a cheap Bible and mark the passage that we preached from.
Right.
And it was amazing how much of the Bible you left out
Oh yeah.
over 12 months.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's true. The lectionary, I mean, so I love the lectionary. The lectionary does end up only choosing certain passages to fall on Sundays. So that does limit the pastor to not preaching on a ton of the Bible if you just go with the passages that fall on Sundays over the 3-year period. But yeah, I mean, I love, yeah.
We're different from a lot of churches because our rector, he preaches Jesus every Sunday.
Yeah.
He saves the rest of it for his lessons during the week.
Yeah.
He's his evangelical.
So he brings it back, yeah,
Okay.
to the center. Yeah. That's good. Did you have a?
Mark,
Oh, okay.
get your hand up. Now you
Yeah.
have to talk.
I'm guilty of violating the commandment because I was the one who did the charcoal drawing.
We've been murmuring about that.
I know.
Mark, me too, I've seen it his hand, so, same.
Well,
I didn't even win his key.
there was a woman that saw that and wept. And wanted to have a copy of it for her Baptist church in Devine, Texas, and so we made a print of it, and the deacons there were reluctant to hang it because
Wow.
it was explicit and might scare children. So it amazes me that we're having this discussion.
Mm-hmm.
The story about that picture is that over 40 years ago, you know, I just was doodling, and so it was a doodle on a sketch pad.
Mm-hmm.
And when I had an assignment a few years ago to do some artwork, I hatched it full scale, and I was concerned about doing it. It was just me. Nobody was telling me to do it. It was just me having this internal struggle.
Wow.
For some of the reasons that we're discussing here, that I'm depicting something that's precious and significant. And will I do it justice?
Right.
Or will I denigrate it? And then when it gets out there, someone weeps and then someone's scared of it.
Right. Wow.
About 15 years ago, we had an artist that loaned and then eventually gave paintings to the church. And they were hung throughout the church, none in the sanctuary. And there was a big pushback, mainly from the deacons, about hanging this iconography in the church. So we've really come a long way.
Wow.
As a Baptist church.
Yeah.
To even be meeting here, you know, we'd probably all be burned at the
Interesting.
And
Okay.
talking about art.
Yeah, John.
Love this discussion. We have 6 inadequate minutes left. If I may humbly submit to the group my own view of this topic, we're hitting on what I think is one of the many beautiful paradoxes of Christ himself and of the Bible as a whole. Solomon built a magnificent gilded temple, and in his sort of not ordination, but his opening ceremony, he said, you know, you are great, you know, the highest heavens cannot contain you, much less this temple that I built. And yet here it is. You know, the Bible is the book in the back of my pocket that guides my life, and it is also, you know, words so holy that, you know, I shouldn't be able to even hear them. Christ was who when John the Baptist said, you know, here comes the Lamb of God who will take away the sin of the world. There will come, not in this order, but there will come one after me, one whose sandals I'm not fit to untie. And he was also the man who washed the horse manure off his disciples' feet, and was transfigured and ascended into heaven, and ascended bodily. So there's all these beautiful paradoxes. I mean, Christ had a body, he had a face, he had hunger pains, and got maybe cranky when he was tired, and had you know, humble bowel movements, and probably got sick to his stomach. And he is fully divine as well. And so, in my humble opinion, it is, well, the both aspects are right. God is too holy to image, and so humble that we can image him.
That we can boldly approach him even.
Exactly. We can call him Almighty Father and Abba. We can do both. And to only focus on one and to build a theology out of only one aspect is to neglect the beautiful paradox, but it's the paradox that is the truth, I think.
Of Christ himself.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The fully divine, fully man. You don't get more paradoxical than that.
Thank you. Yeah. Can I close us with prayer?
I would love that.
Okay. I'm actually going to pray a poem by George Herbert. He's in our time period that we're in right now, and I know I love him. So this is his poem's called Trinity Sunday. So let's pray. Lord, who hast formed us out of mud, and hast redeemed us through thy blood, and sanctified us to do good. Purge all our sins done heretofore, for we confess our heavy score, and we will strive to sin no more. Enrich our heart, mouth, hands, and me, with faith, with hope, with charity, that we may run, rise, and rest with thee. Through Christ our Lord. Amen.